What do all these major companies have in common? They all use Tailwind CSS, and there are several good reasons why they do that. So in this video, Tailwind CSS is an open source CSS framework. It was released in May 2019 and it quickly became one, for example, buttons. It does not provide pre-designed UI components such as cards or buttons. Instead, it provides low-level utility classes that let you build out custom designs directly within your HTML file. These utility classes are basically just small, single-purpose CSS classes that can be directly applied to HTML elements. Before you start to learn Tailwind, you should already know basic HTML and CSS. Tailwind is not a replacement for CSS. No, Tailwind is built on top of CSS, and therefore you need a basic understanding of how CSS works. Now let me give you the 4 main reasons and use it as well. Number 1, efficiency. Tailwind CSS. And number 2, customization. Installed it yet? Just head over to node.js.org. You can download it there for free and just need to follow the installation steps. If you're not sure, just open the terminal inside of your code editor and type in node -v. This will tell you if you already have Node installed on your PC and also show you which version you have installed on your PC. After that, we navigate to Tailwind that we want in tab. So with this video box and choose actual institute and don't forget to change the name here of the project folder. Vite, we choose the name Tailwind project. The name here of the project folder, let's say Tailwind project as a name. Perfect. So with this command, we create a React project with Vite. We choose the name Tailwind project for our project folder, and we also directly add which template we want to use. Then we change the directory into our new created project folder. cd Tailwind project. And inside there, we install Tailwind by running this command here. This will take a moment to load, but it shouldn't take too long. Then this command project in this block here with, we need to replace this block here with that. And in the index.css file, we first want to delete everything, and then we have to add this snippet like that. Perfect. Now we only need to run the command npm run dev inside our terminal and then open up this link here like so, and we're good to go. Tailwind has a lot of pre-built classes, but don't worry, you don't need to memorize all of the names. Instead, I would recommend you to get started by using a cheat sheet. I will link you the best cheat sheet for find installed complete. Now let's take a look at how exactly we can actually use Tailwind. Start by deleting everything that we don't need. In here we start by deleting CSS. Now let's take a look at how exactly we can and perfect. HTML element. And inside this section we want to add a paragraph with some text in it like that, with some text in it like that, and save. Next we want to add styling to the section. Like I already mentioned before, we can apply the Tailwind utility classes directly to the HTML elements. For that, you only need to find the Tailwind class name you are looking for in the cheat sheet and assign it to the class name attribute right in here. So we want our section to have a height of 100 VH. So we search for the CSS property height inside our cheat sheet. And there it is. Then we search for the right value right here. If we click on it, we copy it, and then we paste it in here in the class name attribute right here. Next, we also want to add a background color. Let's say we want a light green. So let's search for background color. There's green. Let's choose one. Let's take this, click on it to copy, and then paste it in here. And now let's save and take a look. Everything seems to be working, and as you can see, it's pretty straightforward to center CSS. You probably went before. Display flags. It's obvious, right? So item center is the same as align item center. Justify center is the same as justify content center, and so on. If you have already worked with other CSS frameworks before, like for example with Bootstrap, then you also know that this M here stands for margin. And if you want to know what the 12 means, just hover over the class name and it will show you that M12 stands for margin 3 RAM. So I would say Tailwind CSS is basically pretty easy to use, but it will still probably take you at least a few hours of practice to really get used to this new concept. With Tailwind, like write the sentence first and then add the break. This is called mobile. To change and adapt the design at different breakpoints. This is called mobile first design. In Tailwind CSS, there are 5 breakpoints by default. Each breakpoint prefix stands for a specific width range. For example, SM here stands for small, and this breakpoint works till a device width of 640 pixels. So with this breakpoint, you can target all devices with a width of 640 pixels and less. MD here stands for medium, and this breakpoint works till a device width of 768 pixels, and so on. If you want to use one of those breakpoint prefixes, you just need to add the prefix followed by a colon, and then add the class name you want to assign to this prefix. Let me give you a short example here. Let's say this is the CSS for our mobile design. Yep. And now we want a padding here between, so for this section of padding, between that there is some space.
Welcome to the complete professional level. You can find this course. In this course, we're going to learn how to build websites from a beginner to a professional level. And by the end of this course, we're going to build youtube.com. Now, you don't need any previous coding or technical experience. This course is designed to be your first step to becoming a software engineer. We're going to start from the very basics of HTML and CSS and build our way up step by step. And along the way, we're going to learn all the major skills that we need to create websites at a professional level. You can find the different sections of this course below the video here and here. And after each section, I'm going to give you a bunch of exercises that you can do on your own to practice the skills that we learned. In total, this course is going to have more than 100 exercises. Lastly, you don't have to worry about taking notes. I created an HTML and CSS reference that will list everything that we learned in this course. With that said, let's get started. I'm going to be doing this course on a Mac, but everything is the same for a Windows computer. Before we begin, we're going to need two pieces of software, a web browser and a code editor. A web browser lets us view websites, stands for the. This file contains HTML, so we have to make, and we're going to call this file here, and we're going to find the folder that we just created. And that, so I'm going to file, and I'm going to find the folder that we just created, which is this one. Now, once that's open, you should see the folder name at the top here and on the side here. Now let's create our first HTML file. We're going to click this icon to create a new file, and we're going to call this file website.html. So we have to make sure that this file ends with .html. This tells the computer that this file contains HTML code rather than just text. So as I mentioned, HTML is basically some instructions you give to the computer. We're going to learn our first instruction, which is less than, button, greater than. And we also need to type less than /button greater than, but our code editor might autocomplete this for us. So this is an instruction to create a button. And inside the button, we're going to have the text hello. Now let's save our file, and we're going to learn how to open this in our web browser. To open our new website, we're going to go to the folder that contains our code. We're going to find our HTML file. We're going to right-click, open with Google Chrome. And now you can see that we have our first website that has a button with the text hello inside. And if we look back to our code, that's exactly the instruction that we gave to the computer. So as you can see, HTML is pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to understand what's going on. Now let's try another instruction we can give to the computer. On a new line, we're going to type less than p greater than. And we also need to type less than /p greater than, and our code editor might autocomplete this for us too. So the p here stands for a paragraph. This is a paragraph of text. Inside a paragraph, we can put some text. So let's put the text, paragraph of text. Now we can save this, and to get our website to reflect our most current code, we're going to go to our webpage and refresh. And now you can see that our website is this. Displaying a paragraph of text, just like we told the computer. I put my cursor here again. These new lines also count as spaces, so the browser essentially ignores them. Wanted some more space between these elements so that it's easier to cite, because extra spaces like these new lines are just ignored. A lot of people like to put the content of the element on its own line like this, so that the tags basically align with each other in the same column. And same thing for here. You'll notice that this line is really long. We can actually add new lines here to make our code easier to read. So when we organize our code like this, we generally indent or add spaces in front of these lines. This helps us clearly tell the difference between the element's tags and its contents. If we didn't have this indenting, then it's pretty hard to tell where this element starts and where it ends, especially when we have a lot of code. Now your indents might look a little different from mine. It might look something like this, where you have more spaces than I do. This happens because by default, VS Code uses 4 spaces per indent. Generally in HTML and CSS, we use 2 spaces per indent. To update this, we're going to go down to this bottom toolbar and click this section. And then we're going to click Indent Using Spaces, and we'll change this from 4 to 2. So now this file is going to use 2 spaces per indent. So we can get rid of this and press Tab to have proper indenting. Now that only affects it for the current file. We can change it for every file going forward by going to the bottom left here and clicking this icon and then going into Settings. And in here we're going to search for tab size. And we're going to scroll down and we'll change the tab size from 4 to 2. Alright, so we just learned the basics of HTML, how to write HTML code and then turn that into a website. We also learned how to write HTML attributes which modify the behavior of an element, and we learned about syntax, which are the rules that we have to follow when writing our code. Elements. In this level, nice looking buttons from famous website code. It's easier for us to set this up by moving our reference. So first, let's work on creating the subscribe button. So just like we learned before, we're going to create a button using HTML. So less than, button, greater than. And then inside our button, we're going to have the text subscribe. And now let's save and refresh our page. And now we have our button. Next, we're going to start changing the appearance of this button so that it looks like the subscribe button from YouTube. Let's go into our code and we're going to start writing some CSS to change the appearance of this HTML element. So to write CSS, we have to create a new element called a style element. So this style element is unique in that it doesn't appear visibly on the page. So for example, if we save our file and then we reload the page, the style element doesn't actually create anything. So the purpose of this element is that inside this element we can write CSS code, which modifies the appearance of other elements. For example, let's write our first bit of CSS code. We're going to type button, open squiggly bracket, close squiggly bracket. And then inside these brackets, we're basically going to give instructions to the computer on how to modify the appearance. For example, we can set the background dash color colon red and semicolon. So make sure that you write this out exactly as I have it here so that we're following the syntax rules for CSS. So let's save this file and refresh our page. And now you can see that we set the background color of the button to red. So as you can see, CSS is similar to HTML. We're simply giving instructions to the computer, and then the computer follows our instructions step by step. And just like HTML, we have to follow certain syntax rules when writing our CSS so that the computer understands our code. So what are the syntax rules for CSS? How does this code work? So the word at the front here is called a CSS selector. It tells the computer which elements on the page we are targeting with our CSS code. In this case, we are targeting all buttons on the page, and we're going to change the background color of all buttons on the page to red. Now inside these brackets, there are other rules that we have to follow. The text to the left of this colon is called the CSS property. It tells the computer what we are changing. To the right of the colon is the CSS value. It tells the computer what we're changing the property to. In this case, we're changing the property background color to red, and that's exactly what the computer did. The colon is here to just separate the property and the value, and the semicolon here is just like a period in English. In English, you end sentences with a period. In CSS, you end a style with a semicolon. So that's what all of this syntax means. So we can actually add multiple styles inside these brackets. So let's go ahead and add another style. We're going to change the text color to white to match this design. So the property for changing the text color is called color. So notice that it's not called the text color. It's just something that we have to remember. We're going to change it to white, and we'll end it with a semicolon. Let's save and refresh. And now you can see that we changed the text color of this button to white. And that's basically how CSS works. We tell the computer what we're targeting, and then we give some styles. And the computer is going to apply these styles one by one. So let's do another example. This time, we'll set the border property. So notice that our button has a border while the subscribe button here doesn't have a border. So we're going to set the border property colon to none. And we're going to save this file and refresh. And now we just remove the border. So if you look at our styles here, it's actually pretty straightforward. They're pretty easy to read. We set the background color to red, text color to white, and border to none. So just like HTML, CSS is pretty straightforward. We're essentially just giving the computer instructions. So the general technique for going from something that looks like this to something that looks like this is to just change these styles one by one. So we're going to continue changing styles one by one until we get our design here. The next style I'm going to change is the height. So our button's a little bit short, I'm going to make it taller. So I'm going to set the height to something like 50 px. The px here represents pixels. Pixels are a very common unit of measurement in the digital world. Image sizes are measured in pixels, video sizes are measured in pixels, and your screen size is also measured in pixels. In this case, we're going to set the button height to 50 pixels. And don't worry too much about knowing what 50 pixels looks like. The more that you write CSS and work with pixels, the more you get a sense for how big these measurements turn out to be. So for now, let's save this file and refresh the page. And now we have a button that is 50 pixels tall. But it actually looks like it's a little too tall. So I'm going to change the height to something like 30 pixels. And we're going to refresh the page again. And I actually want it to be a little bit taller. So I'm going to change it to maybe 36. I'm going to refresh. And I think that looks pretty good to me. So you see that in CSS, we do a lot of trial and error to get our measurements right. Now let's keep working step by step to get to our design. Next, we're going to adjust the width. So let's change this to something like 100 pixels. Let's see how that looks. I'm going to save it, refresh. And I think it looks a little bit too small, so I'm going to increase it just a little bit. 105. And refresh. Okay, I think that looks good enough for me. Next, we're going to change the background color because currently our red is not the same as our design. So VS Code has a really nice feature, which is a color picker. So if we hover over this color box here, it gives us access to a color picker that we can pick another color with. So I'm going to pick something that's a little closer to what I see at the bottom. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to pick something like 200, 00. I'm going to save this and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. So you might be wondering what this value means. We went from a color of red to RGB 200, 00. So this RGB value is another way of measuring color. It's a more precise way of measuring color than just using a word like red or white. So the way that RGB works is that pretty much every color can be created using a combination of red, green, and blue. So that's what this syntax represents. The R represents how much red we have in this color, G represents how much green, and B represents how, and save, that's going to get us a blue color. Have a green color. Create, if you have the color pick value 55 to 55, it creates white. If we set all of these three to 0, that creates black. When we refresh, that creates a black color. So now let's go back to what we had before, which I think was 200.00, and we'll save and refresh. And the next thing we're going to change is, you might not be able to see it, but if we zoom in here, this button has rounded corners, while our button has pointy corners. So to make rounded corners, the CSS property for doing that is border-radius, and the border radius takes a pixel measurement. The higher the pixels, the more round the corners will be. So for now, let's try :2 pixels and save. Now if we refresh the page, our button now has rounded corners just like our design. So I'm going to zoom back out and zoom back out. So the last thing I'm going to change is if we hover over this button, you'll notice that our mouse turns into this sort of hand. This hand is called a pointer. So we're going to change the cursor. The mouse, this thing that you point around, is usually called the cursor, and we're going to change the cursor to a pointer. Let's save and refresh, and that's how you get this hand whenever your mouse is over this button. So that's basically how we go from a basic HTML button to something that looks more professional. We create the button with HTML, and then we set the styles one by one. Now you might be wondering, how do I know all of these CSS properties? How are you supposed to memorize all of these? So usually when I don't know the CSS property for something, for example, if I want to create rounded corners, I would go to Google and search something like CSS and what I want to do. So let's say I want round corners. And usually the first few links give some really good suggestions on what the property is. So here right away we have the border radius property in the first link, and it gives us some sample code that we can use. So that's how I discover all of these CSS properties. I look at a design and I ask myself, okay, what do I need to achieve this design? And then I search for it in Google. So don't worry, as you use CSS more and more, you're going to have to Google things that you don't know, and you'll just get used to the process of finding answers by searching for them. But for the purposes of this course, I'm going to give you a lot of these CSS properties so that you can get some good practice with them. The next step we're going to do is to copy this join button. So let's create a new button on our page with HTML, and this is going to be the join button. So we're going to put the text join inside this button. Let's save it and refresh. And unfortunately, it looks like our join button looks like the subscribe button. And that's because in our CSS, this word button modified class attribute. So we're going to type class equals quotes quotes. So the class attribute basically lets us label HTML elements. For example, let's label this button the subscribe button. And also my code is getting a little long for this line, so I'm going to put the text on a new line to make it easier to read. So remember, according to HTML syntax, these extra spaces don't matter. They're ignored. So now that we set the class attribute, we've essentially set a label to this button, and we can target this label in our CSS. So to target a class in CSS, we can start with a dot, and then we're going to type out the class name. So we're going to type out subscribe-button. So according to CSS syntax, if we start this code with a dot, that means we're going to target a class name instead of an element name like button. So here, we're going to start targeting just any element that has the class subscribe button. So if we save and refresh, now you'll see that all of these styles only apply to elements that have the class subscribe, and our join button does not have any of these styles. Now multiple elements can have the same class. So for example, if I set the class of the join button to subscribe-button, all of these styles will be applied to any element with the subscribe button class. That's what this dot means. And that means these are going to be applied to this and this. So if we save and refresh, now the join button has these styles again because it has a class of subscribe button. But for our purposes, we actually want this to have a different set of styles. So let's give a different class to the join button. We're going to give the class join. And I'm also going to reformat my code a little to make it easier to read. So let's save and refresh. And now we're back to where we can start modifying our join button. Now let's start styling our join button to match our design. So remember, the general strategy is to create the element with HTML like this, and then style it one by one until you match your design. So first we're going to target the class. That's what this dot means. We're going to target the class join-button. Okay, so let's set the background-color to white. Let's save it and refresh. And next, let's deal with the border. So our border is a little bit gray. We can set it to maybe border-color to blue, and let's see how that looks. Let's save it and refresh. Okay, so it looks a little darker than what we have in our design. So let's go into our color picker and pick a more accurate color. I'm just going to do this by eye. Don't worry if it's not totally accurate. We're just trying to get something that's close enough. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to pick something like, maybe something like this. Let's save it, refresh, and that's a little bit too dark, so I'm going to pick something a little bit lighter, save it, and refresh. Okay, I think that's pretty good. But we also noticed that our border is a little weird. So on the top, it looks like it's a lighter shade of blue, and at the bottom, it's kind of a darker shade of blue. So to fix that, we're going to set the border style to be a solid color. Let's save this and refresh, and now we get a solid color all around. The next thing we can change is our border looks a little bit thick compared to the design. So we're going to change the border dash width. So you'll see that a lot of these styles are pretty self-explanatory. So we're going to set the border width to, let's say, 1 pixel. Let's save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Next, we're going to set the text color. So we're going to set the text color to blue and have it the same as our border. So remember, the property to set text color is called color. Colon, I'm going to copy this color down here. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks a little light, but I think it's okay. Now we're going to set the height and the width. So let's set the height to be something like 36 pixels to match our subscribe button. Refresh. Okay, and now we're going to set the width. So let's try, I don't know, 60 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh. Okay, I'm going to set it to maybe 62. Okay, let's save and refresh. And again, we're going to set some rounded corners. So that is border dash radius 2 pixels. We're going to save it and refresh. And now we're almost there to matching this design. The last one we're going to set is cursor pointer to get that nice hand pointer when we're hovering over the button. So refresh. Now when we're hovering over the join button, we have this nice pointer icon. So another thing we notice is that there's a lot of space between these two buttons, and there's not a lot of space between ours. So in CSS, space is called margin. So to add space, we're going to add some margin. So let's go to the subscribe button styles, and we're going to add some margin dash right. So we're going to add some margin or some space to the right of this button. And we're going to set the space to maybe 8 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh, and that looks pretty good to me. So now we're done with the join button. Lastly, we're going to create this tweet button. Let's go back into our code, and remember our general technique is to, number 1, create the element with HTML, and then number 2, style it with CSS one by one. We're going to create a button with a text tweet. I'm going to move my editor a little bit to the right here so we can see it. I'll move this here as well. And let's refresh our page. So now this button has the same style as the join button because it has the join button class, and that's being targeted up here. So instead of the join button, we're going to give a class or a label of tweet button. Now save and refresh, and now we're back to the default styles. So in our CSS, we're going to write some code. We're going to target the class. So we start with a dot to target a class. We're going to target the tweet button class. So just like our other buttons, we're going to adjust the style of this button one by one until we match our design. So let's start off with the background dash color. Let's set it to blue to start off with. Now I'm going to try my best to match the Twitter blue that we have here. So I'm going to pick something like this, and I think that looks pretty good. Save it and refresh. Okay, we'll leave it like that for now. We might adjust it later. Let's change the color now to white. So that'll change the text color. Okay, let's get rid of the border. Refresh and save. Let's give it a height of 36 pixels to match our other buttons. Okay, and the color is a little bit off, so I'm going to adjust it just a bit. Maybe it should be a little more like this. Save it, refresh. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this. Now we're going to adjust the width to maybe 105. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that's a little too much. Let's adjust it to 80. Let's adjust it to 70. So as you can see, there's a lot of trial and error when we're working with CSS. Now to get this rounded effect, we can set a border radius. Let's start with 2 pixels. If we refresh, we get rounded corners. If we start increasing the pixels for the border radius, let's save and refresh, it starts getting rounder and rounder. So the trick to getting these round buttons is we have to set the border radius to half the height or the width, whichever is lower. So in this case, the height is 36. If we set the border radius to half of that, which is 18, save and refresh, that's how we get this rounded color. The last thing we're going to do is to bold the text in here. So in our design, this tweet text here is very bold. So we're going to make our font bold as well. So to do that, we're going to set this property called font. Save and refresh. Okay, I think that looks pretty close just by looking at them. So the last thing for this button is to add the cursor pointer. Let's save it and refresh. So if we hover over this button, we now get a nice pointer for our cursor. So the last thing I'm going to adjust here is the spacing between these two buttons. Remember, space to subscribe button. Our basic buttons and CSS one by one good. So here are a bunch of close enough to our design. This is a good challenge for you to be able to look at a website by eye and use CSS to copy the styles that you see. We're going to learn some intermediate CSS skills, such as how to create hovers, transitions, and shadows. For most buttons you see on the internet, if we hover over them with our mouse, they change their style slightly. Some of them get darker, some of them get lighter. We're going to learn how to do that in our code. So we're going to use the same exercise as before. As a reminder, you can find it at supersimple.dev/exercises/buttons. These buttons, when we hover over them, they actually change their style. So this is going to help us practice learning about hovers. In addition, you'll notice that if we hover in and out, they change their style smoothly, so we can also learn about transitions. And lastly, this tweet button, if we hover over it, it casts a little bit of a shadow. So that'll help us practice shadows. But first, let's work on the hover styles for the subscribe button. Let's go into our code and find the styles for the subscribe button, which is everything here. And now to create a hover effect, we're going to create a new block of CSS. We're going to use a dot to target a class. So this time we're still targeting the subscribe -button. But this time we're going to add :hover, open bracket, close bracket. So inside these are styles that will apply only when we hover over the button. That's what this :hover means. For example, we can set the background -color to green. Now let's save our file and refresh the page. And when we hover over this button, you'll notice that it's green. So the way that this works is that if we are not hovering over, all of these styles apply. So the background color is red. If we are hovering over the button, these styles now apply in addition to these styles. So we're essentially adding extra styles when we hover. So this :hover is known as a pseudo class. It basically adds extra styles in a certain situation. So in this case, it's going to add extra styles when we hover. Another example of a pseudo class is .subscribe button :active. So the active pseudo class activates when we click on the element. So when we click on the button, we can set the background -color to blue. Let's save this and refresh. Now when we hover over, we're going to apply these styles. So the background color is going to be green. And then when we click, we're going to apply the active styles, and then the background color is going to be blue. So let's look at our design and see what kind of hover styles we have. Let's refresh. So when we hover over our subscribe button, it seems to turn a little bit more light. And if we click it, it becomes even lighter. So the way to make our button lighter is using a new property that I'm going to introduce. So let's get rid of these for now. Let's save and refresh. So we got rid of those pseudo class styles. We're going to set a CSS property called opacity. So opacity tells us how see-through an HTML element is. It takes a value between 0 and 1. A value of 1 means that this element is completely normal. So if we save this and refresh, you can see that if we hover over it, it's completely normal. And as we decrease the opacity, let's decrease it to 0.7, the element starts to fade. So if we decrease it even more to 0.3, refresh, now it's even more faded. So the opacity is used to fade out an element. If we go from 1 to 0, the element's going to fade out. So if we set it to 0 and refresh, now it's basically completely transparent and see-through. If the opacity goes from 0 to 1, that means the element's going to start to fade in. So that's how opacity works. For now, if we hover over it, let's set the opacity to maybe 0.8. So it's going to be a little bit see-through, but not totally see-through. So let's refresh and hover over it. Okay, let's look at our design. So that looks pretty close to what we have. Next, let's set the active styles. So in our design, if we click on this, it gets even lighter. So we're going to set an even lower opacity to make our button fade out even more when we click on it. Let's set it to something like 0.4 or 0.5, let's say. Save it and refresh. Now when we hover over it, now when we click, the button gets lighter. And we can compare that to our design, and that looks pretty good to me. Now we're going to work on the hover styles for our join button. So if we look at our design, the colors for this join button sort of inverts. So the background color and the text color, they reverse. So to do that, we're going to go into our code. And again, we're going to target the join button with a dot, join button. And we're going to add a pseudo class called :hover. And now all the styles inside here will apply when we hover over this button. So when we hover over it, we want to invert the colors. So we want to set the background dash color to our text color, which is this. Copy and paste. And we also want to set the text color to our background color. So we're going to switch them up. Let's copy, paste here. Save it and refresh. And now when we hover over our join button, that looks pretty good. The next thing is when we click the join button, you'll notice that it also fades out. So we're going to add an active pseudo class to this button as well. So target the join button class and add a pseudo class called active. So these styles will activate when we click this element. So let's set the opacity to maybe 0.7 maybe. Save it, refresh, click it, okay. So I think that looks close enough. So 0.7 looks pretty good. So that is how we set hover styles and other pseudo classes with our CSS code. Next, we're going to learn how to transition smoothly between these two styles. So for example, if we go back into our project and we hover over this button, you'll notice that the background color and the text color change smoothly. But for our colors, it changes almost instantly. So how do we make this transition? So to do that, we're going to scroll up to our subscribe button first. We're going to add a property called transition. So transition property takes two values. The first one is what we want to transition. So in our case, we want to transition the opacity smoothly. So we want to smoothly fade out the button when we hover over it instead of instantaneously. So let's transition the opacity. And the second value is how long this transition will take. For example, let's set it to 1s, which is 1 second. End it with a semicolon and save. Let's go back and refresh. And now when we hover over our button, you'll notice that the opacity changes smoothly. Now it might be a little bit hard to see, so let's change this to 0.1 to show you the effect. Refresh. So now you can see that the opacity is changing smoothly over 1 second. So this is how you transition between different styles when you're hovering over them. Now let's set it back to 0.8, and we're going to change 1 second because it's a little bit too long. So usually a good transition duration is something like 0.15 seconds. So it's pretty fast, but it's not too fast and it's not too slow. Let's go to our webpage and refresh. Now when we hover over it, we get a nice smooth transition. It might be a little bit hard to tell, but we do get a nice smooth transition instead of what we had before, which transitioned immediately. Let's work on the join button now. So this one is a lot easier to see the difference. Let's scroll down to the join button. And again, we're going to add a transition. So we're going to add transition, and we're going to give it two values: what we want to transition and how long. First, let's transition the background dash color and how long we're going to transition for 1 second as an example. Let's save our file and refresh. Now when we hover over the join button, the background color changes smoothly over 1 second. But you'll notice that the text color changes immediately, whereas the text color here also kind of transitions. So to make the text color transition as well, we need to add another property to transition. So we can actually transition multiple properties. We just have to separate it with a comma. So if we have a comma here, we can add another property to transition. This time I'm going to transition the color, and we're also going to give it a duration, which is 1 second. So how long it takes to transition this property. Save it and refresh. Now when we hover over this button, it will transition both background color and the color smoothly over 1 second. And that's basically how transitions work. So sometimes you might be tempted to put this transition property into the hover because you think that we want to transition when we hover, so we have to put it here. Now the problem with this is that if we refresh, when we hover over the button, everything looks good, but as soon as we hover out, these styles change immediately. And that's because, remember, these styles only apply when we're hovering. So if we are hovering, then we have a transition. But as soon as we take off the hover, it's the same thing as having no transition at all. So that's one common pitfall of the transition property. So let's move it back here where it should be. So just make sure that you put the transition always in this sort of base CSS style. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is how to create shadows. If we go to our project and we look at our design, I'm going to zoom in here. When I hover over the tweet button, it creates a faint shadow under the button. So we're going to learn how to create this. So let's zoom out for now. We're going to go down to the tweet button styles, and the shadow is just another CSS property. So the property for a shadow is box-shadow. Hold it. Now box shadow actually takes 4 values. So I'm going to set the values to 0 for now, and then we're going to change them one by one to see how they work. Let's save this and refresh. And now we do have a shadow, but we can't see it because it's right underneath the button. So the first value here determines the horizontal position of the shadow. For example, I can set it to 10 pixels, and if I save, the shadow will appear 10 pixels to the right. The second value sets the vertical position of the shadow. For example, if I set it to 10 pixels in the second value, it will push it 10 pixels down. So now you can see we actually do have a shadow 10 pixels to the right and 10 pixels down from the button. Now the third value here is the blur. So if we set the blur to maybe 10 pixels, save, refresh, now the shadow becomes blurred. And the last value is obviously the color. So we can actually change it to whatever we want. We can actually change it to something like red. Save it, refresh, and we get a red shadow. So this is basically how shadows work. We have a horizontal position, a vertical position, blur, and color. So don't worry, the more that you work with shadows, the more you'll get familiar with what these 4 values can do. So let's try creating a more realistic shadow. Usually shadows aren't red or any color. They're usually kind of a darker shade of whatever they're covering. So to create a color like that, we're going to need a new way of measuring color. So So let's get rid of this, and we're going to use something called RGBA. RGBA is the same thing as RGB, except there's an A value. So this A value essentially means the opacity of the color, how see-through it is. We can set the RGB to 0, 0, 0. That gets us to black, as we learned. And then the fourth value is our A value. If we set it to 1, let's save, this is going to be pure black. But as we decrease the A value, the color is going to get more and more faded out and more transparent. So if we decrease it to 0.6, save and refresh, now this color is getting more transparent and faded out. So a pretty natural color for shadow is something pretty faint, like 0.15. So for shadows, we usually don't want it to be too noticeable. Shadows are best when they're very subtle. And now we kind of want to move the shadow a little bit closer to the button so it looks a little more natural. So let's actually move it maybe 5 pixels and 5 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So that's how we create a natural looking shadow with the box shadow property. We have 4 values: the horizontal position, vertical position, the blur, and the color measured with RGBA. The A value means opacity, or how see-through this color is. The final step of this lesson is to only make this shadow appear when we hover over the button. So for example, for here, if we hover over, we can see the shadow. If we're not, the shadow's gone. So this is another style of button that we can create. So let's use what we learned so far. Remember, we first use a dot to target the class. So we're going to target the tweet-button class. We're going to add a pseudo class here called hover. And then we're going to move our shadow into the hover pseudo class. Let's cut and paste in here. So remember, the way this works is that, let's refresh first. If we are not hovering over the button, we get all of these styles. If we are hovering over the button, we're going to get these styles, these hover styles, as well as all of these. So these styles get added on when we hover. So now when we refresh and we hover over this button, we're going to get a pretty subtle shadow. It's not perfect, but and we hover over this button, we're going to get a pretty subtle shadow. It's not perfect, but I think it's close enough to what we want. Now the last thing we're going to do is to transition the shadow. So we can actually transition the shadow pretty easily by just adding the transition property. And we're going to tell it what we want to transition and how long. So we want to transition the box-shadow